quite remarkable, in Canada, we've managed to take one of the world's greatest natural resources, the oil and gas wealth we have in this country, and then find a way to make sure we can't deliver it to market. And we have this situation where you have barriers making it impossible to do the obvious. The obvious is building pipelines, getting our oil and gas products, getting them to the ocean so we can sell them on international marketplaces. And the logjam metaphor works because the logjam is not about one log. It's actually about a whole bunch of logs tangled up together in some sort of really Gordian knot kind of a situation that's almost impossible to break. And that's what we have. We have federal regulations and federal laws and legislation that's being considered right now. We have the province of British Columbia bringing all sorts of rules and regulations, the province of Alberta, the province of Saskatchewan trying to get their products to market. We have different Indigenous perspectives. The majority of the largest group of Indigenous people are in favor of pipelines and in favor of building these access points to get our material to market. But then a smaller number of people, but very vocal, on the coast down, particularly by Vancouver, who are opposing this idea. So you have multiple logs jammed up against each other, pushing in multiple directions, and we haven't found the magic that sort of says, how do you break this open so we do what is so important to Canada, which is getting our resources to international markets at fair prices? When Canadians think about what's going on with the oil and gas sector, there's kind of an odd reaction. We can look at it at the macro level. Well, we're not getting as much oil and gas to market, so our exports are declining. Because our exports are declining, the resource revenue sharing is coming to provincial governments and federal governments are quite sharply down. We're talking about billions of dollars here of lost government revenues. But the part that's missing is that Indigenous communities are affected by this in very direct ways. This is not a small sidelight. This is a very real thing. We have 36 oil and gas producing First Nations who count on the oil and gas that comes from their own territories, their own reserve lands, that they've been selling hopefully on an international market, and they can't get proper prices for it. There are communities that are losing $3 and $4 million a year in lost revenue because they're selling at a discounted rate over the international market rates. So what does that mean? Well, these are communities that are using what they call own source revenue. This is their money to use without government control, not to apply to Ottawa for a grant, not to fill in a whole bunch of forms and do all sorts of reporting. This is their money, it's their income, they can use it as they wish. What do they do with it? Some of the communities fund their own governments. They fund their councillors, their chiefs, their administrative offices. Many of them build housing. We know there's a huge housing shortage in Indigenous communities. They fund cultural programs, language programs, economic development programs. They support business development in their communities. So when you have this logjam, several things happen. The revenue slows down. The price that they get for their oil and gas drops very dramatically. The companies that they have, and there are hundreds of Indigenous companies involved in the oil and gas sector, lay off employees. Some of them go broke. They can't keep in operations anymore, right? And as a consequence, you see the other outcome, which is Indigenous communities that were finally sharing in the prosperity of Canada, finally working in a way, using the legislation, using their rights, using their reserves, using their natural resources, using their business acumen. They were doing really great things to build up an economic place within Canada. And now the door's been slammed in their faces. And this is the side of this whole logjam that we're not paying enough attention to. All the other issues are important. The environmental issues, economic development, government revenues, basically employment issues for the country as a whole, those are all critical. But the Indigenous one is a sort of a sour slap in the face. Those communities that figured out how to participate, they'd come to terms with the environmental sort of issues and consequences. They'd convince themselves of the sustainability of the pipeline developments in particular, that they could actually work with that in an ecological sort of way. And then the door's been slammed. So, sorry to mix up the metaphors, but the problem here is that the logjam is of serious and specific consequence to Indigenous peoples.